Sarah is the co-curator of this exhibition, Fabrication. This was a collaborative project just based on the fact that we had very similar practices, and I think noticing so much that was happening around UNSW, it made sense to just grab as many artists as we could. So did you want to talk a little bit about the curatorial process, perhaps how we came about this yellow monstrosity we have here?
Sure. So, one of the biggest decisions in setting up the space was what to do with all the sculptures, where to put them. We thought about putting shelves on the walls or lots of 3D printed plinths, I think we thought at one point. But in the end, the lightning bolt table came out of things that the other person said as a joke. So Danielah was like, imagine if we had a lightning bolt, like electricity. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. and then I was like, imagine if we painted it yellow. And Danielah was like, yeah, that's a great idea. So that's what we did. And
I'm glad we pulled it off. I mean, it could have looked very different.
I think it works. But yeah, Danielah selected the artists before I came on board, but I think it's a really great collection of practitioners who use machines, whether that's computers or CNC routers, a lot of 3D printers, or more as a reference in David's case, to sort of shake up the creative process and establish this kind of dialogue between the mechanical sort of processes that are slightly out of our control and then the human input and how that sort of oscillates between those two elements.
And your practice could definitely be seen as an expanding form of drawing, and I think the most noticeable quality to drawing terminology is the line. There's definitely this like chaos noodle spiral that happens in your work. As this is more a sculptural form of drawing, how do you consider drawing terminology in relation to your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said about the line is definitely the most prominent drawing feature. So like a big part of my practice is extrusion. So it's kind of this interesting process of having this formless mass of material, whether it's clay or silicon or 3D printing filament. And so you have this massive material and it kind of gets forced through a passage into becoming something, or like having some sort of order or linearity. And then sort of layered on top of that process is the shape that you create. So if you're coming just straight from the computer, it's like very automated. But the way I've made these two sculptures, I'm doing the 3D printing process manually. So I'm just sort of going round and round by hand, which makes the shape kind of directly reflect that process and the imperfection of my body doing that process. So I'll sort of lean this way for a bit and then I'll correct and go the other way. So the shapes just kind of emerge, and like the silicon one sort of flopped over, the whole thing flopped over at one point, and then I just kept building up. So yeah, that's how the form
it's almost
comes about.
Tricking this idea of mechanical forms, like you're meant to have the audience decide like how much of it was by the artist's hand and how much of it was a machine-based thing. So we have this very colourful floppy work here called Cat. Could you talk us through some of the naming that you've gone for your works and why you choose quite comical usages?
Well, the names just seem very like off the cuff at the last minute before we make the room sheet usually. But yeah, well, I guess they usually end up resembling something, and that's usually how I make the name. But there is a bit of humour, like this thing that like took me ages to make. There's all these interesting processes that have gone into it, and then it's just like a cat. You could have just like drawn a ball with some spiky ears, and it might have been the same effect. So I guess that humour is part of the practice too, because often I'm dealing with like just things that are really wobbly or weird, and sometimes it makes people kind of laugh because they're a bit uncomfortable. It sort of grosses them out a bit. So yeah, I guess the naming, the humour of the naming sort of ties into that part.
And that's a big aspect of your process as well, how you focus in on the audience experience to the unusualness of your objects and kind of the presence that having these irregular kind of chaotic forms. So could you talk a little bit about that phenomenological kind of aspect you explore in the materiality of your PhD?
Yeah, so I think like the way I work in the studio is very much like just sort of exploring sensations, like, you know, it feels really nice to squeeze this gooey stuff out or to like slice through it, or it's very much like tactile processes. And I think often the ones that are the most sort of interesting or satisfying are quite bodily, like I'm dealing with textures and consistencies that are a bit flesh-like, and then often they end up looking like brains or guts or something. So it is quite of the body and sort of, you know, using the body to make these forms. If that makes sense.
And I'm looking forward in August to be doing a collaborative project with Sarah called Exquisite Corpse. We had originally titled it Extruded Corpse to kind of relate to the practice, but that felt a little bit disgusting as a choice. But did you want to speak a little bit to the logic of that duo show that's coming up?
Yeah, so it's based on, well, we just thought it would be fun to kind of trade sculptures. So I'll start off with something, give it to Daniel, he can do whatever he wants to it, and then give it back, and I do whatever I want, and we keep going back and forth. So yeah, the reference, Exquisite Corpse reference, is to the kind of creative game where one person will draw part of an image and just leave kind of the edge of the drawing visible to the next person, and then they continue the drawing, etc. And you can do it with like stories as well. We did it with stories the other day actually when we were camping. Somebody says the first few sentences and the next person carries on. So anyway, that's the concept, but with sculptures.
It'll be a bit of surrealist fun. So we'll leave it there, and we'll move on to the next person.